I've always thought of my life as predictable. A steady rhythm of work, family, and faith. As a chaplain at Crestview Medical Center, I've spent years walking into rooms heavy with grief or fear, offering words of solace to people I'd often never see again. It's a calling I've cherished, even on the hardest days. But recently, I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet, and it has nothing to do with the hospital. It started with the quiet moments. The ones you might dismiss as nothing if you weren't looking too closely. Like the way my wife, Lila, glanced at her phone during dinner one night, her lips curving into a private smile before she quickly set it down. I told myself it was work. She's a nurse practitioner, after all, always in demand. Still, there was something different in her manner, something that lingered even after the moment passed. I didn't say anything. I told myself not to overthink it. The day things started to feel undeniably off was a Thursday, during my rounds at the hospital. I had just left the room of a patient, a woman who had lost her husband the night before, and I felt the familiar weight of helplessness I always carried after moments like these. Dr. Victor Barnes, head of nephrology, crossed my path in the hallway, looking distracted as usual. But then he stopped, turned, and smiled. "Your wife's dedication is remarkable," he said, almost as if speaking to himself. "Lila?" I asked, though the question felt ridiculous. Who else could he mean? He nodded. "Long hours, tireless effort. She's really something." It sounded like a compliment, but there was something about the way he said it that made my chest tighten. The words felt pointed, as though they carried a meaning I wasn't privy to. Before I could ask more, Barnes had disappeared into a stairwell, leaving me with the kind of unease that's hard to shake. When I got home that evening, Logan, my younger brother, was already there. He'd been staying with us temporarily while he figured out his next steps after leaving the military. Logan had always been blunt, the kind of guy who said what was on his mind whether you wanted to hear it or not. "You and Lila doing okay?" he asked as I walked into the kitchen, setting my keys on the counter. I frowned. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, leaning back against the counter with his arms crossed. "She's been acting, I don't know, cagey. I heard her on the phone last night, talking real quiet. Then she hung up as soon as she saw me. I didn't want to read into it." Logan had a habit of jumping to conclusions, and Lila's job often required confidentiality. But his words stuck with me, especially later that night when she came home late. "Rough day?" I asked as she slipped off her shoes by the door. "Exhausting," she replied with a sigh, but her tone was light, almost cheerful, a mismatch to her words. She kissed me on the cheek, the same way she always did, and headed straight for the shower. I told myself to let it go. Then she introduced Zane Crawford. "It's the craziest thing," Lila said one evening over dinner. "I've been doing some genealogy research, and I found a relative I didn't even know existed." "Really?" I tried to sound interested, though something about her excitement felt strange. "He's a distant cousin," she continued, her eyes sparkling. "Zane Crawford. And get this, he's a patient at Crestview. I saw his name on the nephrology roster and reached out. It felt like a coincidence too neat to be real, but I didn't want to seem cynical. Zane joined us for dinner a week later, and it didn't take long for his presence to start unsettling me. He was charming in a way that seemed effortless, with an easy laugh and a way of speaking that drew people in. Lila seemed captivated by him. I wanted to believe it was just her kind heart, her desire to help a man struggling with severe kidney disease. But then Logan showed me the photos. "You're not gonna like this," Logan said, pulling out his phone. It was a snapshot taken from across the street, blurry but unmistakable. Lila and Zane sitting at a cafe, their heads bent close together in what looked like an intimate conversation. "She told me she was running errands," I said quietly, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Logan raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that there was nothing to worry about. Lila had always been generous with her time, always willing to help those in need. But the more I thought about it, the harder it was to ignore the way she lit up when Zane was around, the way she talked about him with a warmth that used to be reserved for me. And then there was the matter of her volunteering to be his kidney donor. "I just feel like it's the right thing to do," she said one morning over coffee, her tone casual, as though she were talking about donating blood instead of an organ. "Isn't that risky?" I asked, trying to mask the concern in my voice. "Not really," she said with a shrug. "We've already started the compatibility testing, and so far, everything looks promising." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to argue, to ask why she would take such a drastic step for someone she'd only recently met. But I held back, unsure if I was being protective or paranoid. As if all of this wasn't enough, Sabrina Holt, a new member of the hospital board, launched an investigation into the nephrology department. Rumors of anomalies had been swirling for weeks, and now it seemed they were gaining traction. "Just routine," Lila said when I brought it up, but her voice was tight. I wondered if she knew more than she was letting on. By the end of the week, I had started keeping track of small details. A stray receipt left in her purse, a text notification on her phone that she brushed off too quickly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the unease alive. I told myself I wasn't looking for trouble, that I was simply trying to protect what mattered most to me. But the truth was, I was beginning to question everything. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. The next evening, as I left the hospital, I saw Zane in the parking lot. He wasn't alone. Standing with him, in the shadow of the streetlights, was Dr. Barnes. Their conversation looked intense, almost secretive. I slowed my pace, watching as Zane glanced around nervously before slipping something into Barnes's hand. I had no idea what I was looking at, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Lila anymore. I never imagined myself as anything other than a chaplain. My work at Crestview had always felt deeply personal, helping people find meaning in moments of chaos and despair. But now, my reasons for being here were starting to shift. My role wasn't just about guiding others anymore. It was about uncovering the truth. That's why I accepted the offer to transition into an administrative position when it came up. It wasn't an easy decision, leaving the bedside for an office, but it gave me something I desperately needed: access. From my new vantage point, I could see the inner workings of the hospital, the things that didn't make it to patient charts or board meetings. Lila was thrilled when I told her about the change. "I'm so proud of you," she said that night over dinner, her smile bright and genuine, or at least it seemed that way. But Logan wasn't convinced. "This timing feels weird, Ethan," he said after Lila went to bed. "You're not doing this just for the promotion, are you?" I hesitated before answering. Logan had always been good at reading me, and I wasn't sure if I could lie to him outright. "I just need to understand what's going on," I admitted finally. Logan nodded, his expression serious. "Then let me help." True to his word, Logan dove into his own investigation, digging into the background of Dr. Barnes, Zane, and anyone else who seemed connected to Lila's sudden involvement with nephrology. A few days later, he handed me a folder thick with printouts and notes. "You're not going to like this," he said, sliding it across the table. Inside were records, altered patient histories, transplant outcomes that didn't match official reports, and discrepancies in donor matches that couldn't be explained by human error. "Barnes has been cooking the books," Logan said grimly. "It looks like he's been inflating success rates for years. If this gets out, it could take down the whole department." The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. Crestview's nephrology department was one of the best in the state. People trusted it with their lives. And Lila was somehow tangled up in all of this. But how deeply? The question kept me up at night, especially as I started noticing more discrepancies in Zane's case. His diagnosis, his rapid inclusion on the transplant list. It all felt rushed, as though someone had pulled strings to make it happen. I began making subtle inquiries, asking casual questions during meetings and reviewing records during off hours. It was a delicate dance. I couldn't let anyone know what I was really looking for. At home, Lila noticed my growing distraction. "You've been so quiet lately," she said one evening, curling up beside me on the couch. "Is everything okay?" "Just adjusting to the new role," I replied, forcing a smile. She nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further. but her attention quickly drifted back to her phone, where she seemed to be constantly messaging someone. I didn't ask who. Meanwhile, my work with Sabrina Holt was picking up speed. Sabrina was sharp, meticulous, and unrelenting in her pursuit of the truth. Together, we began piecing together the scale of Barnes's deception. Transplant data had been falsified, success rates manipulated to maintain the department's stellar reputation. It was bigger than either of us had anticipated. "I think Barnes is protecting someone," Sabrina said during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "Zane?" I asked, though the question felt too obvious. "Possibly," she said, her brow furrowed. "But it's not just him. There's a network here, Ethan. Someone's diverting medications, altering records. This goes beyond just one doctor or one patient." The implications were staggering, but they also brought everything into sharper focus. The unauthorized diversions Sabrina mentioned? They lined up suspiciously well with Lila's shifts. I didn't want to believe it, but then came the night I overheard her conversation. I had just returned home after a long day when I heard her voice coming from the kitchen. She was on the phone, her tone low and urgent. "It has to be soon," she was saying. "We're running out of time. No, I'll figure it out. I just need the funding to go through." She didn't notice me standing there, frozen in the hallway. When she hung up, I stepped into the kitchen, trying to act casual. "Who was that?" I asked. "Work," she said quickly, her smile tight. "Just coordinating something for one of the patients." Her explanation felt rehearsed, but I didn't press her. Not yet. The turning point came when Logan found surveillance footage from the hospital. It was grainy but clear enough to confirm what I had suspected. Zane and Barnes meeting late at night in the parking lot, their conversation tense and hurried. At one point, Zane handed Barnes a folder, which Barnes quickly tucked under his arm before walking away. I stared at the footage for what felt like hours, replaying it over and over. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just unethical. It was dangerous. By now, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. Barnes was falsifying transplant records to protect someone, possibly Zane. Lila was involved in some way, her shifts and behavior aligning too perfectly with the discrepancies Sabrina had uncovered. And Zane's presence in our lives felt less and less like a coincidence. Still, I couldn't bring myself to confront Lila directly. Every time I looked at her, I saw the woman I had married, the woman who had stood by me through so much. Was she really capable of betraying me like this? As the charity gala approached, I knew I had to act. The event would bring together hospital staff, board members, and donors. A perfect opportunity to confront Barnes and Zane publicly, if necessary. But as I planned my next steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something much bigger than I had imagined. The night before the gala, I found an envelope tucked into my office mailbox. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in bold, sharp letters. "Stop digging, Ethan. Some truths aren't worth the cost." My hands trembled as I held the note, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone knew, and they wanted me to back down. The Crestview Charity Gala had always been a celebration, a glittering evening of music, speeches, and fundraisers to showcase the hospital's accomplishments. Tonight, it was something else entirely. For me, it wasn't about the donors or the glossy brochures filled with smiling patients. Tonight, it was about truth. Standing backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to my lapel, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. My speech was supposed to highlight the hospital's commitment to ethics in medicine. Instead, it would reveal a corruption that ran deeper than anyone suspected. "Are you sure about this?" Sabrina asked, her voice low but firm. "I don't have a choice," I replied, glancing down at the flash drive in my hand. It contained everything. The altered transplant records, the financial discrepancies, and the surveillance footage that Logan had uncovered. I'd worked too hard to piece it all together to back out now. Sabrina nodded, her eyes sharp. "Once you start, there's no turning back." I stepped out onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding me. The ballroom was packed. Doctors, board members, donors, and staff mingling in elegant suits and gowns. Lila sat near the front, radiant in a deep green dress, her smile warm but unreadable. Next to her was Zain, his charm on full display as he chatted with the guests around him. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the podium as I began my speech. At Crestview, we pride ourselves on transparency and integrity. Our patients trust us not only with their health but with their lives. It's a trust we cannot afford to betray. The audience nodded along, their expressions reflecting the gravity of my words. But as I continued, I felt the mood in the room begin to shift. Tonight, I want to address something we rarely discuss. What happens when that trust is broken? A murmur rippled through the crowd. For months now, I've been investigating allegations of misconduct within our institution. What I found was deeply troubling. I clicked a button on the remote in my hand, and the first slide appeared on the screen behind me. A patient chart with glaring discrepancies highlighted in red. These are the records of a transplant patient. You'll notice inconsistencies between the official file and the actual medical data. These were not isolated errors but deliberate manipulations orchestrated by Dr. Victor Barnes. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Barnes, seated near the back, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face a mask of indignation. As head of nephrology, Dr. Barnes falsified transplant success rates to maintain the department's reputation. But that's only part of the story. I advanced to the next slide. Surveillance footage of Zain and Barnes in the hospital parking lot. This man, I said, pointing to Zain on the screen, used fabricated medical records and false pretenses to solicit donations for treatments he never intended to undergo. Zain shot to his feet, his face pale. "This is outrageous," he exclaimed, his voice loud enough to draw everyone's attention. "Sit down," Sabrina said sharply from her table, her tone leaving no room for argument. I pressed on, my voice steady despite the chaos brewing around me. The financial records show that funds raised in Zain Crawford's name were diverted to private accounts. These transactions were linked to unauthorized drug handling and medication discrepancies, which occurred during specific shifts at this hospital. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in before delivering the final blow. These shifts were overseen by my wife, Lila Hayes. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Lila, whose expression had gone from disbelief to shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. To drive the point home, I advanced to the last slide. The photos Logan had taken of Lila and Zain at the cafe, their heads close in a private conversation. Personal relationships and professional boundaries were crossed to conceal the truth. But tonight, we bring that truth to light. As if on cue, two investigators entered the ballroom, making their way toward Barnes. The doctor stood, attempting to maintain his composure, but the beads of sweat on his forehead betrayed his panic. "This is absurd," Barnes shouted as they approached. "You don't have the authority to do this." Sabrina rose from her seat, holding up a stack of documents. "Actually, we do. These are court-ordered warrants based on the evidence we've uncovered." The room erupted into whispers as Barnes was escorted out, his protests growing fainter with each step. Meanwhile, Zain attempted to slip away, but security intercepted him at the door. "You're not going anywhere," one of the guards said, blocking his path. Lila stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on mine. The room seemed to fade away as she took a hesitant step toward me. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling. "I can explain." "No," I interrupted, pulling an envelope from my jacket pocket. "You don't get to explain." I handed her the envelope, divorce papers signed and ready. Her hands shook as she took it, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You don't mean this," she whispered. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. By now, Zain was being led out by security, his once confident demeanor replaced by fear. The gala, meant to celebrate the hospital's successes, had become a spectacle of its failings. As I stepped away from the podium, Sabrina met me near the stage. "You did it," she said, her voice a mix of relief and admiration. "It's not over yet," I replied, glancing toward Lila one last time. She stood alone in the middle of the room, clutching the envelope as the crowd buzzed around her. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity. I had exposed the truth no matter how painful it was. And now it was time to move forward without Lila, without the lies. As I exited the ballroom, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Logan. "Ethan, we need to talk. There's more to this than we realized." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What else could there possibly be? Crestview was a different place after the gala. The scandal had gutted it, exposing cracks in the foundation we'd all thought unshakable. For weeks, the headlines splashed across local and national news. Top hospital rocked by corruption scandal. Patients withdrew their trust, donors rescinded pledges, and staff morale hit rock bottom. But we weren't giving up. I'd spent most of my life helping people navigate chaos, but now I was the one standing in the wreckage. My new title, Director of Ethics and Compliance, felt more like a responsibility than an achievement. Sabrina called it poetic justice, given the role I'd played in unmasking the corruption. But for me, it was more than a job. It was a way to ensure no one else would go through what I had. The first order of business was the audit. Sabrina spearheaded it, working day and night to comb through every inch of Crestview's operations. What she uncovered made the gala revelations look like the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Barnes hadn't just falsified transplant records. He'd inflated success rates for years, concealing complications and botched procedures to maintain the department's prestige. One file after another painted a picture of negligence masked by deceit. Patients who should have received follow-ups were neglected. Complications that could have been prevented were ignored. And at the center of it all was Barnes, who had built his career on the suffering of others. "We're going to fix this," Sabrina told me one night as we pored over the data. Her voice was steady, but I could see the strain in her eyes. "We have to," I replied. "No one will trust us again if we don't." As Crestview underwent a massive overhaul, I found myself navigating uncharted territory. My days were spent rewriting policies, implementing new systems, and holding staff accountable in ways that hadn't been done before. Every protocol was scrutinized, every process tightened. The changes were so rigorous that other hospitals began reaching out, asking for guidance on adopting similar standards. "This could be a national model," Sabrina said during one of our meetings. "Let's make sure it works here first," I replied. Even as the hospital began to stabilize, I couldn't shake the shadow of everything that had happened. The people involved, Zane, Lila, Barnes, were gone, but their impact lingered like a bruise that refused to fade. Lila had moved out of state shortly after the gala. The last conversation we'd had was brief and painful. She'd apologized, of course, but the words felt hollow, as if they were meant to absolve her rather than heal what she'd broken. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she'd said, her voice trembling. "But it did," I'd replied. And that was it. She left Crestview, our home, and our life behind, taking whatever explanation she'd once thought mattered with her. Zane, on the other hand, wasn't going anywhere. He faced federal charges for fraud, along with lawsuits from patients and donors alike. Every time I saw his name in the news, I felt a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion. "He'll never hurt anyone again," Logan said when we discussed it one evening. Logan had found a new sense of purpose in the aftermath of the scandal. His skills with technology and his knack for uncovering hidden truths made him the perfect candidate for Crestview's cybersecurity team. He dove into the work with the same determination he'd shown during his military days, uncovering vulnerabilities in our systems that could have been exploited further. But it wasn't just his career that was flourishing. Logan had grown close to Megan Ellis, a nurse who had stood by him during the darkest days of the scandal. Their bond, forged in trust and understanding, blossomed into something deeper. When he proposed a few months later, Megan said yes without hesitation. The wedding was a bright spot in an otherwise grueling year, a reminder that some things could still go right. As I watched Logan and Megan exchange vows, I felt an ache I couldn't quite place, a mix of joy for them and loss for what I'd once had. My own transformation was harder to define. I no longer wore the chaplain's badge, no longer walked the hospital halls offering prayers and comfort. My focus was singular now: accountability. It wasn't a role I'd ever envisioned for myself, but it was one I had come to embrace. Crestview needed someone who wouldn't flinch in the face of hard truths, and if that meant stepping away from the person I used to be, so be it. Still, there were moments when the toll became undeniable. One evening, Sabrina and I were reviewing the final audit results in my office when she paused, looking at me carefully. "You've done something incredible here, Ethan," she said. I shrugged. "It doesn't feel that way." "It should," she insisted. "But you can't let this consume you. You've sacrificed enough." Her words stayed with me long after she left. Sacrifice, it was the right word. My faith, my relationships, even my sense of self had been casualties in this battle for truth. And while Crestview was beginning to rebuild, I wasn't sure I knew how to do the same. But maybe rebuilding wasn't the goal. Maybe safeguarding the future was enough. Under my leadership, Crestview became a model of compliance and transparency. The new systems we implemented made it impossible for another betrayal to occur without swift consequences. Staff were held to higher standards, and patients once again began to place their trust in us. As I walked through the hospital one morning, the familiar hum of activity around me, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. Not for myself. I wasn't sure I'd earned that yet. But for the institution I had fought to protect. Because this time I knew the foundation was strong. And as long as I was here, nothing, no lie, no betrayal, would ever bring it down again. Years have passed since the night everything unraveled at Crestview, and the life I once knew feels like it belongs to someone else. Back then, I was a chaplain, a man who believed in forgiveness and second chances. Now, I'm someone the medical world calls when the stakes are too high to leave room for error. Hospitals across the country reach out to me, asking for guidance on adopting the compliance systems I implemented at Crestview. The protocols I designed, every rule, every safeguard, have become a gold standard in preventing fraud and abuse. It's strange to think that something born out of such personal betrayal now stands as a shield for countless institutions. My calendar is relentless. One week I'm in Chicago, training hospital executives on early detection of financial discrepancies. The next, I'm in San Francisco, addressing a room full of compliance officers on how to protect whistleblowers. The work is exhausting, but it matters. Every so often, I hear whispers of the people who were once at the center of the scandal. Lila is in Minnesota, or so I've been told. She's kept a low profile since leaving Crestview, fading into anonymity in a way that seems intentional. I wonder if she's found peace or if the weight of her choices still lingers, but I never reach out. There's nothing left to say. Zane, on the other hand, has no choice but to face his consequences. The federal charge is stuck, and he's serving time in a facility upstate. His name occasionally surfaces in articles or interviews about the Crestview scandal, a footnote to a story that defined his downfall. Dr. Barnes tried to rebuild his career overseas, setting up shop in a country where regulations were more lenient. But the connections I've forged over the years have a long reach. Every time he tries to operate under the radar, investigators are tipped off. His reputation, once untouchable, is now a shadow of what it was. Despite their stories crossing my mind occasionally, my focus is on the future. Sabrina often reminds me that my impact stretches far beyond Crestview. She's now the CEO of a major healthcare network, and every so often, she'll call me to share updates or ask for advice. "You've set the bar," she told me during one of our calls. "Hospitals everywhere are following your lead." Hearing her say it feels surreal. My name has become synonymous with accountability, a word that used to feel rigid but now feels like a purpose. Even so, the work takes a toll. Traveling constantly, uncovering deception in places people are supposed to trust, leaves little room for a personal life. I keep in touch with Logan and Megan as much as I can, though their lives seem so far removed from mine. Logan has flourished in his role at Crestview, helping secure the systems I once feared were irreparably broken. He and Megan now have 2 children, and their home is filled with the kind of warmth that feels almost foreign to me. I visit when I can, watching as their kids run through the yard or cling to Logan's leg as he laughs. Their happiness is genuine, and I'm glad for it. But there's a distance between their lives and mine, a chasm created not by choice but by circumstance. I've built something meaningful, something lasting, but it's solitary work. Sometimes I think about forgiveness, about what it would mean to let go of the bitterness that still simmers beneath the surface. Sabrina has mentioned it more than once, hinting that I've focused so much on consequences that I've forgotten what comes after. I'm not sure forgiveness is necessary, I told her the last time she brought it up. It's not about them, Ethan, she replied. It's about you. Her words stayed with me, though I'm not sure I agree. To me, forgiveness feels like a luxury, a soft place to land that doesn't exist when trust has been shattered. Consequences, on the other hand, are undeniable. They're the reason people like Barnes and Zane can no longer harm others. And they're the reason people trust me to protect them. Each case I take on feels like a continuation of what started at Crestview. The hospitals I work with are better prepared, their systems stronger. And every time I uncover another breach of trust, I refine my methods, making it harder for anyone to slip through the cracks. In time, the name Ethan Mercer has become a deterrent. Whistleblowers cite my work as inspiration for stepping forward, and institutions think twice before cutting corners, knowing that someone like me is out there. It's not the life I imagined for myself, but it's the one I've built. When I walk into a hospital now, I don't see the hopeful faces I used to greet as a chaplain. I see systems, checks and balances, vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. It's not cynical. It's realistic. And yet, I hold on to the belief that what I do matters. One afternoon, after a long week consulting in New York, I returned home to find an envelope waiting for me. It was from Sabrina. A simple note thanking me for my work and sharing how her network had implemented a policy inspired by my protocols. At the bottom, she'd written, "Integrity isn't easy, but it's worth it. You've proved that." I sat with the note for a long time, the words heavy but comforting. The betrayal that had once defined my life no longer feels like an open wound. It's there, of course, a scar that reminds me of where I've been, but it no longer consumes me. I've become a guardian of trust in a field that desperately needs it, and while the cost has been high, the impact is undeniable. As I prepare for another flight, another hospital, another case, I think about the legacy I'm leaving. Not in my name, but in the systems I've helped build and the people who will benefit from them long after I'm gone. Because in the end, it's not about forgiveness or closure. It's about ensuring that no one else has to pay the price I did. That, to me, is enough. 10 years after the Crestview scandal, I stood at the podium of a packed conference hall, staring out at an audience of healthcare leaders, policymakers, and professionals from across the country. The moment felt surreal. A decade ago, I was unraveling a conspiracy that shook my entire life to its core. Now, I was here to talk about how we rebuilt trust, not just at Crestview but across the industry. This is the paradox of trust. I began, my voice steady and firm. It takes years to build, seconds to break, and a lifetime to repair. But when trust is fortified with vigilance and integrity, it becomes a foundation no betrayal can destroy. The room fell silent. Every eye fixed on me. I shared stories of hospitals that had adopted the systems I developed, highlighting how reforms had saved lives, prevented financial abuses, and restored faith in healthcare institutions. I talked about whistleblowers who felt safe coming forward, patients who received the care they deserved, and leaders who took accountability seriously. As I wrapped up my speech, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not for myself, but for what we had accomplished. The legacy of Crestview had transcended its scandal, becoming a model of resilience and reform. The applause was thunderous as I stepped away from the podium, and Sabrina was waiting in the wings, her expression a mix of pride and determination. "You've come a long way, Ethan," she said as we walked together through the bustling conference center. "We both have," I replied, glancing at her. Sabrina had become a powerhouse in the healthcare world, leading a network of hospitals that had embraced our compliance protocols. Every time we spoke, she reminded me of why this work mattered, even when the toll felt overwhelming. "Do you ever think about how far this has spread?" she asked. "The lives we've impacted? The lives you've saved?" "It's hard to wrap my head around," I admitted. "But I know it's worth it." While my professional life had reached heights I never imagined, my personal relationships were another story. Logan's career in cybersecurity had taken off, his expertise in securing healthcare systems making him one of the most sought-after specialists in the country. Megan had become a leader in pediatric medicine, her work transforming the way hospitals approach childhood care. Together, they had built a life full of joy, raising 3 kids in a home filled with laughter and warmth. I was proud of them, but I also felt the distance between us, one I couldn't seem to close. Logan and I still spoke regularly, but our conversations often revolved around work. He would update me on the latest threats to cybersecurity, and I would share stories from the hospitals I was consulting with. It was productive, but it wasn't personal. I missed the ease we used to have, the brother who had stood by my side during Crestview's darkest days. Meanwhile, there were reminders that the fight for accountability never truly ended. Bradley, my trusted investigator, called one afternoon with news that stirred old memories. "Dr. Barnes is back," he said bluntly. I leaned back in my chair, my grip tightening on the phone. "What do you mean?" "He's resurfaced under a new identity, opened a private clinic overseas. It looks like he's trying to start over." The anger I thought I'd buried flared to life. Barnes had been the architect of so much pain and deception, and the idea of him slipping back into a position of trust was unthinkable. "Do we have enough to expose him?" I asked. "More than enough," Bradley replied. Within days, I ensured the information reached the proper authorities. Barnes's activities were reported, and investigations were launched. This time, I had no doubt justice would be served. The work we started at Crestview had grown into something larger than I ever expected. Hospitals from coast to coast were implementing policies inspired by our reforms, and my name had become synonymous with integrity. I often heard from whistleblowers who cited my story as their motivation to come forward, and from leaders who wanted to ensure their institutions were beyond reproach. Yet, despite the accolades and the respect, I couldn't ignore the changes within myself. There were times I thought about my days as a chaplain, about the people I had comforted and the prayers I had offered. Back then, I believed in the power of forgiveness, in the idea that grace could heal even the deepest wounds. Now I wasn't so sure. Forgiveness felt like a fragile concept, one that couldn't withstand the weight of betrayal. What I believed in now was accountability, the idea that actions had consequences, and trust had to be earned, not assumed. "Do you ever miss it?" Sabrina asked one evening after dinner. "Miss what?" I replied. "Being a chaplain, offering comfort instead of judgment." I thought about her question for a long moment before answering. "I don't miss the illusions," I said finally. "I used to believe in forgiveness as a cure-all. Now I believe in prevention." Sabrina nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've turned pain into purpose, Ethan. Not many people can say that." As the conference drew to a close, I found myself walking through the quiet halls of the hotel, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The betrayal I experienced at Crestview had shattered so much. My faith, my relationships, even my sense of self. But from that destruction, I had built something lasting. Hospitals were safer now. Patients were protected. Systems were stronger. And while I may never fully regain what I lost, I had found a purpose that mattered. That was enough. Later that night, as I packed for yet another flight, I received a message from Logan. It was a photo of his kids, dressed in pajamas, grinning at the camera. "Family movie night," the caption read. I smiled, staring at the image longer than I intended. Maybe I wasn't as far from them as I thought. A decade ago, I could never have imagined this life, one defined by vigilance and justice, built on the ruins of trust shattered in a hospital I once called home. The Crestview scandal had been a crucible, burning away every illusion I held about people, systems, and the fragility of integrity. What remained wasn't just a career. It was a mission. Today, hospitals across the nation operate with unprecedented transparency. My protocols, once considered radical, are now embedded in the foundation of healthcare systems. From whistleblower protections to real-time auditing software, The systems I designed have exposed corruption before it could fester and ensured that accountability isn't just a goal but a standard. Ethan Mercer compliance policies. That's what administrators call them now. A name that feels more like an obligation than an honor. They trust me to keep their institutions safe, to guard against the betrayals that once nearly destroyed me. Lila's attempts to reshape her narrative never gained traction. She stayed in Minnesota, working sporadically in smaller clinics. Her once promising career reduced to whispers of what could have been. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she tried to frame herself as a victim of circumstance, blaming Zane and Dr. Barnes for her downfall. But the truth didn't care about her excuses. Zane, meanwhile, remained a cautionary tale. His name often surfaced in conversations about fraud prevention, his story shared as a warning during compliance trainings and industry panels. By now, he had become a symbol of greed and manipulation. A man who tried to twist trust into a commodity and paid the price for it. Then there was Dr. Barnes, whose shadow still lingered. His attempts to rebuild his career had failed spectacularly. Every time he emerged under a new name or in a new country, the network I'd established ensured he was found. His reputation was permanently tarnished. A lesson that no betrayal goes unanswered. Through it all, Logan remained one of the few constants in my life. His family had grown, their home filled with laughter and the kind of joy that reminded me what I'd sacrificed. Uncle Ethan, his youngest, Emma, squealed when I visited last Christmas, her arms wrapping around my legs. Logan watched from across the room, a knowing smile on his face. "You've got a fan," he said, handing me a mug of hot cider. In moments like those, I felt a flicker of something beyond the mission, something I hadn't allowed myself to dwell on for years. But as much as I loved Logan and his family, I couldn't help but feel like a visitor in their lives. Professionally, I'd reached heights I hadn't thought possible. My name carried weight in the healthcare industry, and hospitals sought my guidance to preempt crises. Administrators respected my relentless pursuit of accountability, even as they whispered about my unyielding nature. "It must be exhausting," Sabrina once said, "carrying all of this." "It's necessary," I replied. She didn't press me further. By now, Sabrina understood that this wasn't just work for me, it was atonement. Not for something I'd done, but for what I'd allowed to happen when I trusted too easily. The accolades didn't matter. Neither did the reputation. What mattered was ensuring no one else had to endure the betrayals I'd faced. As I prepared for my next investigation, a multi-state hospital network accused of mishandling donor funds, I found myself reflecting on the path that had brought me here. I'd started as a victim of betrayal, blindsided by the people I trusted most. That betrayal had broken something in me, but it had also awakened something else. A fierce determination to protect what others took for granted. Logan once asked me if I regretted the choices I'd made. "Regret's not the right word," I told him. "I miss parts of who I used to be, but I can't ignore the good that's come from this." And there had been good, more than I cared to admit. Hospitals were safer now. Patients received the care they deserved. Leaders thought twice before cutting corners, knowing that someone like me was out there. As I stepped onto the plane for another flight, I glanced at the files in my hand. Names, dates, financial records, all pieces of a puzzle that I would piece together, exposing another betrayal and ensuring justice was served. The work was endless, and it demanded everything I had. But for the first time in years, I felt a quiet sense of peace. Not happiness, not contentment, but purpose. Because as long as I was here, no betrayal would go unanswered. That, to me, was enough.